Eric Dolphy and, the later period, John Coltrane, among hundreds of others, initiated and practiced from the late 50s into the early 70s, was to restore black music to its original identity as a medium of spiritual utility. When these men abandoned an adherence to chord progressions, the 32-bar song form, the fixed beat and the soloist accompanist format, and began to employ, among other things, simultaneous improvisations, fragmented tempos and voice-like timbres, they were very deliberately replacing, with ancient black methodologies, those Western concepts and systems that had, by their lights, worked to subvert and reduce black music in America to either pop music or, for many of them no less a corruption of what black music was supposed to be, an art form. Alan Silva, a one-time bassist with Cecil Taylor and then the leader of his own 13-piece orchestra, made the point in an interview I did with him for Rolling Stone. "I don't want to make music that sounds nice," Silva told me. "I want to make music that opens the possibility of real spiritual communion between people. There's a flow coming from every individual, a continuous flow of energy coming from the subconscious level. The idea is to tap that energy through the medium of improvised sound. I do supply the band with notes, motifs and sounds to give it a lift-off point. I also direct the band, though not in any conventional way, like I might suddenly say, chord, but essentially on dealing with improvisation as the prime force, not the tune. The thing is, if you put 13 musicians together and they all play at once, eventually a cohesion and order will be reached, and it will be on the transcendent plane." I commented in the interview that, Silva says his band wants to commune with the spirit world and you aren't sure that it doesn't. With 13 musicians soloing at the same time, at extraordinary decibel levels, astonishingly rapid speeds and with complete emotional abandon for more than an hour, the band arrives not only at moments of excruciating beauty, but at sounds that rising in ecstatic rushes and waves and becoming almost visible in the mesmerizing intensity, weight and force of their vibrations, do for sure seem to be flushing weird, spectral things from the walls, from the ceiling, from your head. Of course not all of these musicians shared Silva's position entirely. Some saw the music as an intimidating political weapon in the battle for civil rights and exploited it as such. Others, like Taylor, didn't quite emphatically regard themselves as artists. For Taylor, a pianist and composer who took what he needed not just from Ellington and Monk, but from Stravinsky, Ives and Bartok, it wasn't about jettisoning Western influences on jazz, but about absorbing them into a specifically black aesthetic. For the most part, however, disparities among the younger musicians of the period amounted to dialects of the same language. All of them shared that new black consciousness, a new pride in being black, and their reconstruction of jazz, their purging of its Western elements, or their assertion of black authority over those elements, was, to one degree or another, intended to revive and reinstate the music's first purpose. Silversaw brought extra musical ramifications in his procedures. He believed that by rejecting all externally imposed constraints, the inherent goodness in men would surface and enable them to function in absolute harmony with both nature and each other. "Man," he said to me once, coming off an especially electrifying set, "in another 10 years we won't even need traffic lights. We're gonna be so spiritually tuned to one another." And I have to say that I agreed with him. This was, after all, a period in history when restrictions of every conceivable kind, from binding social and sexual mores to, with the moonshot, the very law of gravity, were successfully being challenged. And if you were regularly visiting Timothy Leary's atomic level of consciousness, and if you could call a girl you'd been set up with on a blind date and she might say, "Let's ball first and then I'll see if I want to have dinner with you," you could be forgiven your certainty that nothing short of a sea change in human nature itself was taking place. And some of us who regarded Western values as both the cause of all ill, had they not brought us to the brink of annihilation with the hydrogen bomb? And the principal impediment to such a transformation, saw the new black music as leading the way, as the veritable embodiment of what Herbert Marcuse called the revolution of unrepression. In so heady a time, earnest unself-conscious debates about the relative revolutionary merits of free jazz and rock, the other musical phenomenon of the period, were not uncommon. I remember a conversation I had with John Sinclair, the Michigan activist, poet and author of Guitar Army, and the co-author, with me, of Music and Politics. John took the position that rock was the true music of the revolution. No, I argued, rock did stand against the technocratic, Faustian Western sensibilities. It did, and unabashedly, celebrate the sensual and the mystical. But in these respects it only caught up to where jazz had always been. In contrast to what some of the younger black musicians were up to, the purging of white elements African music had picked up in America, rock was simply the first hip white popular music. Rock, it was my point, never got beyond expressing the sentiment of revolution, while free jazz, by breaking with formal Western disciplines, by going outside, as the musicians termed it, of Western procedures and methods and letting the music find its own natural order and form, got to an actualization of what true revolution would be. Rock's lyrics, I said, promoted, in many instances, the idea of a spiritual revolution, but musically rock remained bound to the very traditions and conventions that its lyrics railed against, and the audience never got a demonstration for the experience of authentic spiritual communion. Rock's lyrics were undermined and attenuated in the very act of their expression by the system used to express them. The new jazz, on the other hand, achieved freedom not just from the purely formal structures of Western musical systems, but, implicitly, from the emotional and social ethos in which those structures originated. As I say, it was a heady time. Now, of course, free jazz, in anything resembling a pristine form, just barely exists. and obviously it has ceased to exist altogether as a revolutionary movement. Like other emblematic movements of the epoch with which it shared the faith that a new kind of human being would surface once all structure and authority that wasn't internal in origin was rejected, free jazz was ultimately ambushed by its naivete. But on purely musical terms, free jazz has not been without an ongoing impact. If it never achieved what Alan Silva expected it to, it did, however, contrary to its original ambition, expand the vocabulary and the field of options available to mainstream jazz musicians. And while they function today in what are essentially universes of their own, Taylor, Coleman, Murray, Cyril, Shep and Dixon are still very much around and continuing to discover surprise and the marvelous. Indeed, stripped though they may be of their mystique as harbingers of an imminent utopia, these extraordinary musicians continue to produce musical miracles as a matter of course. For an always compelling demonstration, try to catch Cecil in one of his live performances. What he would call exchanges of energy with drummers like Tony Oxley. In a bad time in every department of the culture, a time of rampant, often willful, mediocrity, I could name no better tonic. Edited remarks on the 60s from the interview that followed. It's admittedly facile to cast it this way, but you could say that what we mean by the 60s began with the Cuban Missile Crisis and ended with the moonshot. The moonshot and the Yuppies' failed attempt to levitate the Pentagon and shake out the demons that inhabited it. At bottom, the 60s were a reaction to the prospect of total annihilation posed by the invention of the hydrogen bomb, and they were routed in the belief that what was wrong, what had brought us to this place, was the denial and suppression of our true selves, of the human beings we were intended to be. This belief, variously shaped, nourished and focused by a conflation of psychedelic drugs, birth control pills, the popularization of Freudian psychology and Eastern philosophies, glaring racial and gender inequities, and a clearly unjustified war in Vietnam, opened virtually every tradition and institution, every custom and convention and every embodiment and instrument of authority, order and structure, to attack, on one level or another, everything from the anti-war, civil rights and women's rights movements, to the anti-materialism and sexual abandon of the period, to spontaneous prose, rock and free jazz, stemmed from the conviction that somewhere in antiquity humanity had taken the wrong path and that the course could be corrected. The enemy was the superego, the cultural, social and psychological restraints we'd inflicted on ourselves. Destroying the superego would yield the good human beings we were supposed to be. It was, again as Marcuse described it, a revolution of under-oppression. We wanted to abolish the apparently arbitrary and misbegotten rules that artificially limited us and led to deluded thinking and behavior. We wanted, ultimately, to abolish the constricting forces of guilt and shame themselves. Guilt and shame were invented by authority. They were tripped governments and parents laid on you to keep you in line. We wanted to take an unfettered pride and joy in our bodies. We wanted to be free of the guilt and shame that have crippled and disfigured us. This is where Jerry Rubin was coming from.